Hi all, and welcome back. Jake and Zach here from the Australian Reptile Park, and today we're back with Elvis. Now we've seen a few other animals on these live streams, and we've already met Elvis a couple of times, but we thought he's so incredible, we have to bring you a little dose of Elvis every single week. Now what we're going to be doing today is feeding Elvis. It's always a bit exciting for us coming in here, and it's a bit different for us today because we're typically doing this in front of a few hundred people. As you can see, we've got no one, but Elvis still needs to be fed, and we still like to keep him in the routine of being fed and going through the process of us coming in here and working around him. It's very important when you have such a large and potentially dangerous animal to keep them familiar with you and what's going on. Now Elvis is of course a saltwater crocodile. They're also sometimes referred to as the estuarine crocodile or Indo-Pacific crocodile. Crocodylus porosus is their scientific name. At the end of the day, it does not really matter what you call them. What doesn't change is the fact that they are the world's largest reptile. Now Elvis here, we don't exactly know how old he is. We estimate he's somewhere in his mid-50s. But we do know he's about 4.6 meters in length and he weighs about 450 kilos. Now the largest saltwater croc ever recorded, at least in recent times, was captured in the Philippines, and that croc measured just shy of 6.2 meters in length and was over 1,000 kilos. So to imagine a male saltwater croc twice the weight of Elvis is pretty incredible. Now I mentioned the Philippines. They've got a very large distribution. Of course they're found in the northern parts of the country, but they do extend beyond our borders. You find them right throughout PNG, Indonesia, and throughout much of Southeast Asia, including up into the Philippines and right across into India. So an extremely large range. And across that range, of course, they are incredibly feared, and good reason for that. They are potentially one of the most dangerous animals you could ever come into contact with. And a big part of that is the fact that they've been around for a very, very long time. Saltwater crocs, or crocodilians as a whole really, have been on the face of the earth for about 260 million years, and in the form we see here today, about 65 million years, virtually unchanged. Now if you go 65 million years unchanged, you are pretty well the perfect predator, and that describes a saltwater crocodile perfectly. They are incredibly dangerous, particularly at the water's edge, and we're going to try and demonstrate that for you here this afternoon. I might get Zach to move the croc around to the other side, and then we'll bring him back around and offer him his first bit of food on this side. Now what we're going to try and attempt to do is show you a few of the natural techniques that a saltwater crocodile would use in the wild to locate and ambush prey. Now a saltwater croc, when it's 2 to 3 meters in length, maybe in its teenage years up into its 20s, it's going to be primarily feeding on small water birds, fish, potentially turtles, and small mammals, maybe the size of a bandicoot or so. At this size, 4.6 meters, he is considered certainly a large male croc, and he would be feeding almost exclusively on what we call medium to large sized mammals. So kangaroo, wallaby, even something the size of a water buffalo. Elvis, a croc this size, could certainly drag into the water and subdue. Now, they of course live in the water, but they are very explosive and very dangerous right at the water's edge. That is what they are designed to do. They are what we call an aquatic ambush predator. They're living in the water, but they are specializing in those land-based prey items. So what they're doing in the wild, they're living in dark, murky water. Today we've got the luxury of beautiful crystal clear water, but you do not have that in Cairns or Darwin or the Kimberley, where these animals occur. They would be living in dark, murky rivers, and they would very simply go unnoticed. You can see the way, you might not be able to see it now, but you'll see it when he comes back around. He does not make a single ripple or disturbance on the surface as he moves. Now right now he's about 4 inches below the surface, 450 kilos, not a single disturbance. Now he can do that due to all those lumps and bumps that line the back and the tail. We call those osteoderms or scutes. It's essentially a little piece of bone underneath the scale, and they create currents and countercurrents beneath the surface which cancel each other out, allowing even very large males like we have here to move, as I mentioned, just inches below the surface without a single disturbance. It is an incredibly effective way of sneaking up on a potential food item. Now we're going to bring him around one more time, and you'll notice Zach is using either his foot or that big stick there to create vibrations. He's not creating any, the croc, but Zach certainly is. And the reason he's doing that is that all crocodilians have tiny pressure receptors, we call them ISOs or intercomentary sense organs, which enable them to pick up on tiny vibrations created in the water. Now in the wild, of course, they'd be using this to hone in or zone in on a potential food item. So if a kangaroo or a wallaby comes down to the water's edge, they stick their head in the water, that is exactly what that croc will be waiting for. It will slide up, very stealthy, and then put on a strike. They'll grab that animal, typically on the head or a forelimb, they drag it into the water, and they very simply drown it. Now, with all that being said, I'm going to jump in here, and I'm going to create some of those vibrations that I just spoke about. This should cause Elvis to come in right at this spot. And today we've got a little bit of chicken for him. I might just shut up and concentrate just for a moment. What I'm watching is those back legs and that tail. Get out of it now. All right. There we go. Now you saw that explosiveness that I spoke about. He's going to munch it a few times here. And you'll notice he lifted his head up and out of the water, there it goes, to swallow that bit of food and a bit of a burp as well. Now they do that because they have a backward facing tongue, it's called a palatal valve, and they can't open that valve underwater. So when he's swallowing, the head is always going to be up like that. Gives you a really good view at that head and those teeth. Now I'm going to sneak past here. We've got another bit of food for him, but we are not going to offer him this bit at the water's edge. We'll instead get him to kind of leap out of the water a bit. This is something that particularly small crocs would do in the wild to perhaps snag something like a roosting bird or a flying fox. We call it a tail walk, sorry. And they use their thick muscular tail to propel themselves up and out of the water. Now this is a very dangerous feat, in fact. We've got a much longer stick here, but I'm side on to the croc slightly, so I'm going to try and stay in front of him here. And he sees the food now, he's onto it. I'm going to avoid these plants. He likes this deeper patch of water here. Preferably they do this in quite deep water. Get him to go one more time and he can have it. Oh, maybe twice. Yeah. Oh, no. Take that back. And now we're going to bring him in. It's an alarmingly short stick, but we'll see how we go. Notice now, he's not mucking around. He's got his head on the surface, and he's going to come straight out for us. Try and lift that head for you a bit. All right. And now, hopefully he heads back in. But whilst he's out, take a good look at him. He does spend most of his time in the water, but whilst he's out, you get a really good picture as to how impressive this animal is. I mentioned before, 450 kilos, and yet when there's a bit of food in front of him, and he's in that shallow water at the water's edge, they are just so explosive, so dangerous. He's wagging the tail in the air. As I mentioned before, they use that tail almost like a propeller. They propel themselves out of the water. Now, it's quite dangerous for me to duck past there now, so what I'm going to do is move Elvis just to this corner here, and then I'll jump out and he might answer some questions. All right. Now you notice even as well, as he's moving, even with the head on top of the surface, he's only exposing his eyes, his ears, and his nasal disc on the end of the snout. Now that's about 2 or 3% of his entire body mass, and yet whilst doing that, he can hear, see, and smell exactly what's going on. Another superbly adapted trait which enables them to remain almost completely hidden. You would have no idea that there was a big male saltwater croc sitting right there, as I mentioned, if we were in dark, murky water in their natural range.
We heard a few really good jaw slaps. Do you just want to go through the mechanics of what's happening with that?
Yeah, so those pop or cracked sounds that you hear, they're what we call a jaw pop. And what's causing that, it's not the teeth coming together. If the teeth were to hit together that hard, they'd probably snap and break off. The teeth interlock a little bit like the zipper on a jacket. So when that jaw comes together, the bones of the jaw is what's coming together and making that hollow crack sound that you hear. It's very impressive and very alarming as well when you're this far from him.
How did Elvis come to be at the Australian Reptile Park?
Yeah, so we haven't always had him. He hasn't been in captivity his entire life, certainly. He was a wild-caught croc, as are most big male captive crocs right throughout the world. He was caught up in Darwin Harbour back in the early 2000s, so about 18 years ago. He was caught out of Darwin Harbour. He ended up in a croc farm for about 3 or 4 years. Now, if you're a big male croc like Elvis in a croc farm, you've pretty much got one job, and that's to breed with the females in that croc farm and make more baby crocs. Now, Elvis didn't quite want to do that. He wanted to continue living his bachelor lifestyle that he would have done in the wild. He was the top dog, he was dominant, and he didn't want any females or any other crocs for that matter in his territory, his pond. So they attempted to breed with him. They popped a couple of females in over a couple of years, and he killed them essentially. Quite brutal, but just goes to show how powerful he is. He has killed other crocs, and of course that's not going to work out in a croc farm too well when your main purpose is breeding. So he ended up here at the park in early 2007. We've had him ever since, and we're very fortunate to have Elvis. He's a really good looking croc. As you can see, he's very good with us working in there. We can mow the lawn, we can clean his pool, have hoses in the water, everything, and he goes great, he's fine. But of course, when we go in to feed him, that's when you get a good glimpse as to how dangerous he is, and it gives people that can come and view the croc feed typically a very good idea as to how saltwater crocs work and why they are so dangerous in the wild.
How old can saltwater crocodiles get to?
Well, nobody knows really. Crocodilians have a very long life, quite similar to a human typically. So I would expect a saltwater croc on average to be living perhaps between 80 and 100 years. Once they get over 100 years in age, they start to show it. They get a bit slow and they kind of back right out. They stay out away from other crocs for the most part. They start to lose all their teeth as well. So of course eventually they die at some point, but it depends on the species. Freshwater crocodiles have been known to live in excess of 120 years of age. So nowhere near as long as something like your Galapagos tortoise that we have here at the park that could live in excess of 200 years, but certainly in excess of 80 years.
Why do you feed such small food items?
Yeah, in a typical feed here at the park, we'll feed fairly small portions. You would have seen he got a bit of chicken today, just a few hundred grams really. And that is because saltwater crocodiles, like all reptiles, are ectotherms. They expel very little energy, and as a result, they don't require much food at all. In the wild, a big male saltwater croc might feed on 200 kilos of food a year. And that's going to be spaced out over maybe 8 or 9 feeds every couple of months. So they don't need to feed every single day in the wild. They would perhaps be going several months without feeding. But in a captive environment, we're feeding him more frequently, and as a result, we cut right back on the food, but he still gets the same amount over the year as he would in the wild.
We're getting a few questions about breeding, so can you maybe go through the breeding and like how many eggs they have and the nests?
Yeah, absolutely. So a female saltwater croc, she's going to become sexually mature at perhaps 7-8 feet in length. It's very important to keep in mind that the females are dwarfed by the males. There's a strong difference between the two in terms of size. So a female saltwater croc is never going to reach these 15, 16, potentially 20 feet lengths that a male might. They tend to max out at about 10, 11, 12 feet would be an enormous female. Now, usually when the male is who wants to breed, they're quite passionate. They'll go in, they're very slow, they're very gentle with the females, and they'll defend the females quite vigorously. Of course, you get the odd male like Elvis that doesn't want to have anything to do with any other croc, including females. But typically, if a male has a girlfriend, they're very protective and they're very good with that girl. They'll breed, of course, during the breeding season, and then like all crocodilians, that female will head up onto a patch of ground on the water's edge, and they'll make a nest. Now, it's not like a bird's nest where you've got this beautiful little circle made of sticks and leaves. What they do, they kind of just make a pile of rotting debris. They'll use sticks and leaves, but it's not presented very nicely. It's just a mound of rotting debris, and then the female will lay the eggs inside, and she could potentially have up to 60 eggs. They'll incubate inside the nest for about 2 months or so. And the interesting thing we see with all crocodilians is sex determination between the different temperatures. So if you were to incubate a saltwater croc or a gator egg a little bit higher, typically what you'll get is a very high proportion of males within that clutch. If you incubate them slightly lower, 4 or 5 degrees lower, then you'll end up with a lot of females. So it just depends, and of course in the wild you're going to have different temperatures throughout the nest, and that way you get that nice even sex ratio typically in the wild. But you can basically do your own thing in captivity and produce what you want with an artificial incubator.
Can they lose their teeth?
They certainly can, yeah, and there's a couple of reasons for that. I touched on one just before, and that is age. A saltwater croc will lose and replace their teeth throughout their life, but eventually that stops. Eventually they'll lose all their teeth, they can't replace them, and they just end up all gum and virtually no teeth. And that is typically a sign of a very old croc. But they can also lose the teeth for a few other reasons. One is diet. If they've got a poor captive diet that doesn't have much variation in it, they can sometimes lose the teeth because of that. So you want to try and avoid that as best you can. And of course, we here at the park, we provide Elvis with a wide range of food items. So today he got chicken. Chicken is kind of your staple captive croc diet, but you want to vary it, of course. You want to feed fish. We feed quail, we'll feed beef, deer, all sorts of things to make sure that he's getting a nice varied diet. And as you can see, his teeth are perfect. Right now, as I mentioned, he's in his mid-50s, so he's pretty well in his prime as far as a male croc goes. He's got virtually all of his teeth. They're really large, they're really white, and yeah, overall he's a very good looking croc.
Can their teeth grow back when they lose them?
Typically yes, at this age, and certainly when they're younger, they'll lose the teeth throughout their life, but they do grow back. So it may take a bit of time, particularly if they lose a really large one. If you look, you may not be able to see now, but just in front of the eye is typically where their largest tooth is. We call that the eye tooth. And if they lose that, it can take a bit of time to grow back just because they are so large. But typically they're pushing through just within a week or two of them losing it. But as they get a bit older, that process slows right down to eventually not growing back at all.
And last question for today, are they endangered?
Not these days. They're doing pretty well in the wild. Certainly not what they were back in the 1920s, say, but very unfortunate for saltwater crocodiles right throughout the 40s, 50s and 60s. They were prolifically hunted for the skin trade. We've all seen those crocodilian skin products, and throughout that 30-year period, we lost the majority of saltwater crocs in the wild in Australia. In fact, in 1968, there was just 3,000 saltwater crocs right across northern Australia. They were in quite a dire situation, but fortunately by 1973 they were made a protected species in all 3 states that they occur in. So that's Queensland, the Northern Territory, and WA, and since then, of course, their numbers have made quite the comeback. These days we see about 250,000-60,000 saltwater crocs in northern Australia. So not endangered, but at some point, or one point, they were certainly on the verge of extinction in Australia. Now I hope you enjoyed that, guys. We certainly do. Obviously it's a very dangerous thing to do, come in here and work with a large male saltwater croc, but as a reptile keeper, it's a ton of fun. We love doing it. We love Elvis. He's a fantastic croc, and we're going to continue to bring you these videos each and every day on the weekdays, and who knows, you might even see Elvis next week as well. We're going to try and bring him to you fairly frequently just because he is so impressive. Thank you, guys. Hope you enjoyed that. Tune in for more videos like this, and we'll see you next time. Thank you. Cheers.